Steam hissed from the last train as Eleanor Rae Maddox stood alone on the cracked wooden platform, clutching her worn carpet bag like a lifeline. The cold October wind cut through her thin dress, tugging at the torn veil hiding the scar that ruined her life. Boots echoed, but no one came for her. They just stared. What do you do when the world says you're too damaged to love? She came west hoping someone would look past the burn that marked her. Instead, she was left behind like freight nobody wanted. But as dusk fell over Ironwood Junction, a shadow stepped forward. Silas Boone, a cowboy with a scar of his own. He looked her in the eyes and said, "If you're tired of being nowhere, I've got a place you can come home to." Steam hissed through the early evening air, drifting like ghosts from the underbelly of the last departing train. The old Ironwood Junction station, just a stretch of cracked wooden planks and a leaning telegraph post, felt more like a graveyard than a place of new beginnings. Somewhere beyond the rails, a crow cawed, a lone, distant echo that made Eleanor Rae Maddox's shoulders tense beneath her second-hand traveling dress. She stood at the far edge of the platform, half shadowed by the pale glow of the station's lone gas lamp. Her gloved hands clutched the worn handle of an old carpet bag, its corners frayed, leather cracked like her once delicate hopes. The bag sat heavy against her boots, the same boots she had scrubbed raw back in Kansas, scrubbing away old ash and the memory of fire. But there are some stains you can never quite wash out. The wind, sharp with the bite of late October, tugged relentlessly at the thin fabric of her dress. A modest brown calico she had stitched herself, hemmed 3 times to fit the only shape she trusted anymore, a body marked by fire. That wind found its way under her torn black veil, pulling it back just enough for the station's dim light to catch the edges of the scar that carved its way down her left cheek. Faint in the dusk, but visible. Visible enough. She felt the stairs long before she saw them. A pair of farmhands unloading crates by the freight shed paused, their rough laughter dying on the cold air. An old woman at the far end of the platform pressed a gloved hand to her lips and turned away, pretending to fuss with her parcel. They didn't see Eleanor's eyes, the soft gray steel of them, the quiet dignity that rose up like a second heartbeat every time someone looked too long at the ruin on her face. They only saw what was broken, not the girl who had survived the fire, not the woman who had crossed 2 states on faith and fragile letters, just the scar. Steam drifted past her shoulders, curling around her veil like the ghost of a promise that once tasted sweet. She remembered the words, "I don't care about beauty, Miss Maddox. I want a wife who can stand beside me, who'll build a life, not just pose in it." He had signed every letter with hope and intention. Words inked with lies are still words, she reminded herself, her fingers tightening around the carpet bag until her knuckles turned bone white beneath her gloves. Boots echoed on the platform, footsteps that did not come for her, but passed her by without a word, carrying other reunions to brighter corners of the station. She did not turn to watch them go. There is only so much heartbreak a person can bear in one night, and hers had been laid bare the moment Charles Pennington spat his final cruelty. "Find someone else to pity you. I won't be tied to a freak." The platform felt colder now, as if the last warmth had departed with the train that should have carried her to a home she would never have. She drew her coat tighter, the black veil falling back across her cheek, half hiding the truth no amount of cloth could fully conceal. The carpet bag's weight anchored her to the planks. A bundle of hope turned to ballast. She stayed like that as dusk deepened, small, scarred, yet standing, alone but not yet crumpled. For what do you do when the world says you're too damaged to love? Eleanor Rae Maddox knew one answer. You stand until your legs give out, because you've been left behind before, and you survived, and somehow heartbreak alone is better than being pitied for being broken. Steam drifted in slow, curling ribbons across the platform as dusk deepened its hold on Ironwood Junction. Eleanor Rae Maddox stood where the shadows reached for her boots, trying to be smaller than she was, a forgotten parcel left behind by the world. She didn't notice the shape at the far end of the platform at first, half blurred by steam and the last orange threads of daylight. Silas Boone had been there longer than she'd realized. He stood just beyond the flickering circle of the old gas lamp, one shoulder leaned lightly against the freight shed's splintered wall. The wide brim of his weathered hat hid his eyes for a heartbeat. Then a shift in the wind lifted the steam just enough to reveal the man behind it. A rugged cowboy, broad in the shoulders but not looming. He wore a battered sheepskin coat that moved gently in the cold October breeze, edges fluttering like a promise of warmth in a place that had grown too cold for kindness. But it was his hands that caught her attention first. Strong, work-calloused, yet surprisingly careful as they cradled her hat. The hat, she hadn't even noticed it had fallen when Charles turned away and left her standing in front of the crowd that would never meet her eyes again. But he had. Silas Boone had noticed. He hadn't stepped forward then, hadn't made a show of pity or chivalry when the sting was fresh. He waited until the last freight man had disappeared behind the depot doors, until only steam and dying whispers remained. Eleanor's breath caught when she saw what the steam revealed next. The burn scar that curved along his jaw, pale and uneven, like lightning etched into weathered skin. He made no move to hide it. He didn't pull up his collar or turn his face into shadow. He simply let her see him as he was, marked but standing. He stepped forward, boots creaking on the old planks, and stopped just close enough for her to see the hint of warmth in his eyes beneath the brim. Not pity, she braced for that, but it didn't come. There was only a calm steadiness, as if he had known the weight of staring eyes before. Without a word, he held out her hat in both hands, like it was something worth saving. His voice, when it came, was low and dry, with the hush of a man who spent more hours on horseback than he did in company. "Figured you'd want this back," he said. Eleanor's fingers hovered in the air for a moment, then brushed against his gloves as she took the hat. It felt absurdly heavy for something so small. She tried to mumble thanks but found the words stuck behind the tightness in her throat. Silas didn't press her. He just gave a slight nod, the scar on his jaw catching the last breath of light as he stepped aside to let her stand tall again. She realized then, maybe for the first time that day, she wasn't entirely alone on that platform. Hope didn't come like a roaring train. Sometimes it stepped out of the shadows with a scar of its own, and hands steady enough to lift what you didn't even know you'd dropped. The door of the Frontier Saloon creaked open on a dry gust of October wind, scattering pipe smoke and loose gossip into the rafters like startled crows. Inside, oil lanterns flickered above grimy tables, casting long shadows over hardback chairs, scarred floorboards, and faces that didn't know how to look away politely. Eleanor Rae Maddox felt the hush before she heard it. One moment, the piano man was banging out a ragged tune to drown the tension of rough laughter and spilled whiskey. The next, his fingers stumbled on the keys, a single note ringing sharp and lonely before fading into the kind of silence that sticks in the throat. She stood just inside the threshold, the door nudging her back like it wanted to close her out, like the room would rather pretend she'd never stepped across it. Her boots felt heavier than iron as they rested on the threshold where sawdust met the scuffed floor. Her worn carpet bag dangled from her wrist, the weight of everything she had left to her in this world. But it was not the bag they stared at. It was the scar, the ragged trail of ruined skin that marked her left cheek, half exposed under a torn veil that fluttered uselessly at her shoulder. She tried to mend that veil a dozen times on the ride west, pricking her fingers raw in the glow of train lamps. But no matter how many stitches she made, the world would still find a way to look straight through the gaps. A whisper slithered through the hush. Then another. Calloused hands rose to half-cover mouths that never missed a chance to twist mercy into mockery. "That's the bride from the station, ain't she? Poor thing. Should have kept the veil pulled tight. Scarred up like a mule kicked her. Shame." Eleanor's chin dipped. For a breathless moment she saw herself as they did, the pitying glances that stung sharper than outright cruelty, the half-curled lips pretending they cared for her misfortune while savoring the spectacle of her standing alone. But she was not alone. Not tonight. Silas Boone stepped forward out of the shadows behind her, his boots echoing a steady beat against the boards, a heartbeat she could lean on if her knees forgot how to hold her. He wore his battered sheepskin coat draped loose over his shoulders, and beneath the wide brim of his hat, the pale scar on his jaw caught the lantern light like a silver mark carved by survival itself. He did not stand in front of her. He didn't shield her from the staring eyes like she was something to hide. Instead, he stood just at her side, close enough that his shoulder brushed hers every time she breathed in. His gloved hand slipped over hers, big and calloused, curling around her smaller fingers with a warmth that settled deep into the hollow places that used to echo with shame. The piano man cleared his throat, but the keys stayed quiet. A ranch hand halfway through lifting his glass, lowered it back to the table like he'd forgotten what whiskey was for. The barmaid behind the counter paused in her polishing, her rag frozen against the chipped glass. From a corner booth, a man with dusty boots and a mustache that twitched with every new rumor leaned toward his companion. I heard he took her in. Scar for a scar, huh? His friend snorted into his beer, not brave enough to look Silas in the eye. Ain't no honest man would keep a thing like that around. Eleanor flinched at that word. Thing. Her throat tightened, an old bruise blooming fresh under her collar. But then Silas's thumb traced a small circle over her knuckles, grounding her like the calloused bark of a cottonwood that stands through every prairie storm. When she looked up, he was already watching her, not the crowd. In his eyes, she saw not pity, but a promise. Let them look. Let them talk. They do not get to decide who you are. A woman with painted lips and a cheap lace shawl leaned across her table, voice dripping sweet venom. Should have stayed on the train, darlin'. Ain't no place here for marked girls. Eleanor's heartbeat kicked like a colt. Her instinct screamed to drop her eyes, to tuck her face back behind the ragged veil, to bolt for the door before the hush turned to laughter. But Silas squeezed her hand again, not tight like a man claiming ownership, but steady like a man who'd stand by her even if the walls fell in. So she lifted her chin instead. The scar glowed under the flickering lantern light, ugly and raw and real. And hers. The hush deepened until it felt like the whole room was holding its breath, waiting to see if the broken bride would fold in on herself like freight no one claimed. She didn't. Silas's voice broke the silence, low but hard enough to carve through the gossip. Say what you've got to say to my face, or keep your damn tongues behind your teeth. And so they stood, the scarred cowboy and the abandoned bride, hand in hand at the threshold of a saloon that would never forget the night they refused to bow their heads. The hush inside the Ironwood Junction saloon didn't break when Silas Boone stepped forward. It deepened, like the room itself was holding its breath, waiting to see just how far this scarred cowboy would go to stake his claim on something everyone else had written off. He stood tall in the center of that smoky room, boots planted wide on the warped floorboards, worn smooth by the boots of men who never looked at scars straight on. The oil lanterns above them flickered with every draft that crept in under the swinging doors, throwing shadows like restless ghosts across the walls. Shadows of men leaning forward, of women freezing mid-whisper, of the piano man's hands hovering an inch above his keys, but not daring to strike a single note. Eleanor Rae Maddox felt the heat of every stare cling to her skin, lingering like the ghost of the fire that had once claimed half her face. Her carpet bag lay forgotten at her feet now, a crumpled thing that no longer felt like her anchor. Instead, her anchor was Silas, solid and unmoving, his arms slung warm and sure around her shoulders. He didn't stand in front of her like a shield. He didn't push her behind him to hide what everyone was already staring at. He kept her beside him, his hand tangled with hers. Their fingers laced so tight, not even the venom in this room could pry them apart. A man near the bar cleared his throat, a sound that echoed too loud, cutting through the hush. The barmaid's rag squeaked against a glass that was already clean. Somewhere, someone stifled a laugh that ended up more like a choke. Silas heard it all, and still, he didn't flinch. He drew Eleanor in closer, his palm broad and warm against the small of her back, anchoring her where her legs might have given out. She felt the tension in him, not the threat of violence, but the weight of a man who'd carried his own scars too long to stand by while someone else's got torn open. Eleanor's eyes darted to the door, to the rows of curious eyes peeking through the curls of pipe smoke, to the piano man, to the woman in the corner with the bright red lips whispering behind her fan, to the ranch hands waiting for the show they'd talk about for weeks. But when Silas touched her chin, her gaze snapped back to him. His thumb brushed the corner of her scar, not gentle, but sure, like he wanted her to remember this wasn't just a wound. It was proof she'd survived. He dipped his head, and for half a heartbeat, she thought he'd whisper something only for her. a promise she'd tuck away, a vow that might crumble once the hush turned to laughter. But Silas Boone didn't believe in secrets when it came to what was his. He kissed her scar, bold, deliberate, right there where every single pair of judgment-heavy eyes could see. A gasp fluttered through the saloon like a startled bird. Someone dropped their glass. It hit the floorboards and rolled under a table, ignored. The barmaid's rag stopped mid-swipe, her mouth opened just enough to let out a soft, disbelieving "oh." The piano man finally rested his hands in his lap. No music dared compete with this. The kiss wasn't long. It didn't need to be. It lingered just long enough for the room to understand that Silas wasn't pitying the mark on Eleanor's cheek. He was claiming it, honoring it, telling the world it did not make her less, but more. When he pulled back, he didn't look at Eleanor first. He looked at the crowd, eyes like river rock, calm but unyielding. He dared them to find their courage, to spit their poison while he was standing right there beside her. "If you can't bear to look," he said, voice low but carrying across the hush like a whip crack, "then turn your damn heads." His words settled over the room like smoke. Heavy, choking, undeniable. Nobody spoke, nobody moved. They sat, caught between shame and something that felt uncomfortably close to envy. Eleanor, whose knees had quivered under the weight of pity for years, felt them steady now. Her fingers tightened around Silas's hand, not just for support, but to remind him she was still there, still standing, still not backing down. Together they stood, ringed in the flickering gold of the lanterns, two scarred souls who refused to be hidden anymore. And in that raw, defiant hush, Eleanor Rae Maddox realized the truth that had brought her to the edge of the saloon floor. Sometimes it's not the scars that ruin you, it's the fear of letting the world see them. Tonight, she'd let them look, and with Silas Boone at her side, she'd let them remember. The hush inside the saloon clung to Eleanor Rae Maddox's shoulders like the last ghost of who she'd been. A woman who once flinched at every stare, who bent her head to hide what the fire had carved into her skin. But as she stepped over the threshold with Silas Boone at her side, that hush didn't follow her out into the twilight. She left it behind, drifting among the sawdust floors and stale gossip where it belonged. Outside, the air felt bigger than the walls she'd been suffocating in for so long. The streets stretched dusty and wide under the purple bruises of a prairie dusk. Lanterns glowed from the front porches of the general store and the old boarding house down the block, throwing warm pools of light that couldn't quite touch the shadows between buildings. They didn't speak at first. The silence was its own kind of music. Boots scuffing against dry earth, the soft rustle of Eleanor's tattered skirt brushing Silas's leg every other step, the distant lowing of cattle in the pens beyond town. She realized then that she could breathe again, not just shallow sips to keep from crying, but deep enough that her ribs ached in a way that reminded her she was still here, still whole. Beside her, Silas's hand remained tangled with hers, rough fingers curling firm and gentle all at once. He didn't walk a half step ahead to drag her along, and he didn't linger behind like he might let her take the brunt of their neighbor's stares alone. They matched each other stride for stride, two shadows cut from the same stubborn cloth. As they passed the first porch, a curtain twitched behind dusty glass. Eleanor's eyes flicked that way, catching the shape of a woman half hidden in the lamplight, mouth parted like she might call out. But the window dropped back into place just as quick. Further up the street, the front door of the barber's house stood cracked open, the faint glow of a lantern inside framing the curious faces that leaned just far enough to watch, but not enough to be seen. Eleanor's throat burned with words she didn't know how to speak. They glowed in her chest like hot coals. All the fear she'd carried on that cracked train platform, all the loneliness that had stuck to her skin like smoke, all the shame she thought she'd never wash away. And yet now, each word felt smaller under Silas's quiet presence, under the thumb that brushed slow circles over her knuckles, grounding her in this moment that belonged to no one else. Her eyes glistened, but the tears refused to fall. Not here, not now, when every step forward felt like a promise made to the woman she'd been. The woman who'd waited for a man at Ironwood Junction, only to be told she was freight no one wanted. Now she was a woman walking into the dusk with a man who saw the ruin and called it beautiful. Silas glanced sideways at her then, catching the shimmer in her eyes with a tilt of his head that asked if she was okay without demanding an answer. Eleanor felt her lips curve, raw and trembling at the edges, but a smile all the same. She squeezed his hand, a wordless vow that she wasn't going to run. Not anymore. Behind them, the hush of shifting curtains and muted gasps scattered like the dust their boots kicked up. Let them watch. Let them spin their stories about the scarred cowboy and the bride left at the station. Let them see that scars weren't chains. They were proof that sometimes the broken don't just survive. They keep walking, together. And so they did, into the gathering dark. The last fingers of sunset brushing the horizon. The street stretching on and on like a road meant only for the two of them. A road where the hush of shame would never catch up again. So maybe you've never stood on a cracked wooden platform, hiding a scar behind a torn veil while the world turned its back. But in some way, we've all known what it's like to be told we're not enough. Not pretty enough, not young enough, not perfect enough to be chosen or loved. Yet here's what Eleanor Rae Maddox and Silas Boone remind us. Scars, whether they're on your skin, your heart, or your past, don't make you unworthy. They prove you survived. In today's America, so many of us, especially as we grow older, carry quiet wounds no one sees. The loss of someone we loved, mistakes we can't erase, dreams we packed away for good. But just like Eleanor and Silas, we get to decide what happens next. We can stand in the open and say, "This is who I am. Take it or leave it." And when we find the rare souls willing to stand with us, hand in hand, we hold on, tight. Maybe you think Eleanor and Silas rode off into an easy sunset. Or maybe life threw more storms at them. Maybe they built a small ranch. Or maybe gossip never fully stopped. But one thing's certain. They chose to stand beside each other when it mattered most. Scars and all. And that choice? That's the kind of courage we all still need. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever felt judged for a scar no one else could see? Do you think real love looks past what the world calls broken? Share your story in the comments below. Your words could remind someone out there they're not alone. Thank you for spending your time with this story tonight. If it touched your heart, please give it a like, subscribe for more frontier tales of second chances, and share it with someone who believes that true love and true courage never grow old.